it's the topic. It's my topic. It's the one I prefer going back to the most because it affects everything, and that's free speech. And a new book is coming out soon called Free Speech in Canada, A Beginner's Guide from Ancient Roots to Modern Controversies. The co-author joins me now, Christine Van Geyn. Hi, Christine. How are you?
Hi, I'm great. Merry Christmas. Happy Hanukkah. Hope you're having a good holiday break.
Thanks. I am. And Merry Christmas to you as well. Christine is the litigation director at the Canadian Constitution Foundation, and you folks have defended a lot of people who are having various charter issues, including over the pandemic, the whole convoy protest issue. You got some interesting results there. Can we first go back to that controversy and why the Canadian Constitution Fund went to bat after the federal government invoked the Emergency Measures Act? You guys went to bat for some of the protesters that were targeted there.
So actually, we were not representing the protesters. We were representing ourselves as a public interest advocacy organization.
Okay.
There were some individual protesters who were represented in the same case because they all got consolidated. But we were arguing that the Emergencies Act that Trudeau used, which allows him to create criminal law by executive order. It's a very extraordinary piece of legislation. It's only available in extraordinary and very specific circumstances, like, there's a giant natural disaster, a war, a terrorist attack. We say that he invoked it illegally, that criteria to use it was not met, and that the regulations that he created under that Emergencies Act, because he gained all these powers to create these new regulations like freezing bank accounts and prohibiting public gatherings, that those regulations were unconstitutional. And the court agreed with us, and they found that invocation was illegal, the regulations were unconstitutional, and that was, I think, probably one of the most important civil liberties cases in a generation. It's going to be appealed, and the appeal is being heard the first week of February. So we're looking forward to defending that excellent decision by Justice Mosley of the federal court.
Although that sort of back and forth, I guess, raised a lot of eyebrows when we read about how far the federal government went. Even the most kind of left wing, even progressives, might go, okay, well, that's a bit aggressive. In your experience in the past few years under this prime minister, has free speech declined in Canada?
I think that there's no question that this is a government that is hostile to freedom of expression, that it views expression, whether it's speech, writing, art, whatever, they view it as a threat to democracy. And free expression is not a threat to democracy. It's actually how we defend democracy. It's a necessary foundation to having a democracy. So they could not be more wrong about their worldview, about this fundamental right that we've had since ancient days. It is a very special and precious right. We need to defend it against things like the Emergencies Act, which the court found did violate the right to freedom of expression, speech, and against other pieces of legislation that this particular government has introduced, top of mind being Bill C-63, the Online Harms Act.
Christine Van Geyn joins us. The book, which you can pre-order now, is called Free Speech in Canada, A Beginner's Guide from Ancient Roots to Modern Controversies. In terms of online harms and that movement, I don't want to assume, but I'm guessing that's sort of mixed into the book at some point. What is your take on the government's efforts to control the internet, regulate it, in some cases censoring parts of it? Yeah,
so Bill C-63 is covered in the book, sort of in a couple of different areas. And the book's actually available for order now. You don't have to pre-order. It actually launched on December 9th. So I have a copy in my hand right now.
Great. Congrats.
So, thank you. So the issue with Bill C-63, the Online Harms Act, is that it kind of does four things. The first is it creates a massive new bureaucracy to regulate what the government calls online harmful content. And some of that content, I agree, there should be greater power to remove, like abuse images of children, sexually abusive images of children. But it also covers content that is more subjective, like what the government defines as hate content, which is notoriously difficult to define. Police and courts and individuals all struggle with what rises to that threshold. The second thing that the piece of legislation does is it creates new criminal offenses for offenses motivated by hatred with a potential life imprisonment, which means an individual who creates another offense, if they're found, like, for example, vandalism, if that offense is found to be motivated by hatred, they could be subject to a threat of up to life imprisonment. And for context, keep in mind that this is a government that releases repeat violent offenders on bail. So you can sort of see where their priorities are lying. The third thing that the Online Harms Act does is it creates what is referred to as a civil remedy for hate speech. So if you see what you think is hate speech online, you can call up a bureaucrat at the Canadian Human Rights Commission and say, I feel discriminated against by this hate speech that some individual has, posted on X. And that individual will have to defend themselves against the commission and potentially the tribunal, where they can be fined up to $70,000, some of that money going to the government, some going to the person who complained, all at no cost to the complainant. So it becomes, and this is on that subjective standard of what constitutes hate, which a lot of people struggle to identify. Now, the last part of the bill, the Online Harms Act, deals with more search powers for abuse images of children, sexual abuse images of children, and penalties for platforms that don't remove that type of content. And I think that part of the bill could have passed on unanimous consent if it had been introduced on and as its own bill in May when this was all originally introduced. That issue should be dealt with completely separately. It's not at all related or similar to these other things the government is doing. So I think that this government has a big problem with desiring to censor speech that it doesn't like, even if it's speech that you and I might not agree with.
Christine Van Geyn joins us. She is the litigation director at the Canadian Constitution Foundation, and she is the co-author of a book that's out now called Free Speech in Canada, A Beginner's Guide from Ancient Roots to Modern Controversies. What kind of tradition is there in Canada for free speech? I know we can talk about American history a lot, history in Europe, but does Canada have a rich free speech tradition?
So I think it's important to put things in context. So Canada does not have the same really robust protections for freedom of speech that the United States has. The United States has what I think is the strongest protections for free speech in the entire world, and probably the strongest in human history. But Canada's not. Honestly, we're not doing too badly, despite the actions of certain governments, certain levels of government, to try to increase censorship. Because when you look at the whole range of human history, and even the world today, the right to freedom of speech and to express yourself and to criticize your government, as I just did, that is still a rare thing even today in most of the world. And it's special and precious that we have that right here in Canada. And that's why we fight so hard to protect it. Now, the book does go through some of that history, dating back to Socrates. We talk about the Magna Carta. We talk about the printing press and the Star Chamber and how all through every technological innovation, governments have tried to censor speech. And so it shouldn't come to a surprise to us, I suppose, that in the age of social media and technology and the internet, that our governments are seeking to censor there too, because this has always been the case. But we have some really excellent decisions in Canada on freedom of speech as well. And, we have the Bill of Rights, which requires federal parliamentarians to consider freedom of speech when enacting laws. We have protections in the Charter. We have pre-Charter cases like the Alberta Press case, which is a 1938 case basically about fake news. That was a law back in 1938 in Alberta that said if a newspaper published something critical of the government, then the newspaper was obligated to run a rebuttal by the government. And that law was struck down. Even before we had a charter, it was struck down under our Constitution. And we have some excellent case law, even recently on freedom of speech. The 1989 case of Irwin Toy is a famous case about the charter and how broad that protection is. We also have a case out of Quebec, a really famous one that went to the Supreme Court called Mike Ward and the Quebec Human Rights Commission. And that was a case which held there is no right not to be offended. So, I criticize the government a lot for any attempt they make to censor speech, but when you put that in the context of where the rest of the world is and where we are in human history, Canada's not doing too badly. And we should celebrate that while still holding our governments to account.
I covered the Mike Ward case closely because I'm interested in free speech, but also stand-up comedy is sort of like a hobby, I guess, and the two worlds collided there. But that was a close call. I mean, we were one Supreme Court vote away from living in a very different country.
I absolutely agree with you. We intervened in that case to argue for broad protections for freedom of speech. I wish that it had been, a blowout in favor of the right to freedom of expression. I was very uncomfortable with how close it was. But in the end, the result is a good one.
What do you make about the concept of hate speech? It's been around in Canada for quite some time. From my perspective, it seems like the quote-unquote success as far as prosecuting hate speech is very mixed, but we keep doubling down on it and keep on coming up with different types of free speech, community-specific free speech towards Jews, towards Muslims, towards Indigenous people. Is this the right approach?
So in the United States, there is no criminal prohibition on hate speech. In Canada, we have criminal code prohibitions on hate speech. We don't have a statutory definition of hate. We have a definition that comes from a series of cases from the Supreme Court that essentially conclude that hate is the most extreme manifestation of the emotion, detestation, and vilification. If that leaves you confused, I don't blame you, because it has left, the police who are the ones tasked with enforcing it, and the courts who are tasked with sort of applying it, it's left them confused too. But our hate speech prohibitions, our criminal hate speech prohibitions, which include offenses like publicly inciting hatred, willfully promoting hatred, advocating genocide, and then there is a specific one for the Holocaust denial in Canada. The other three, the Holocaust denial one is a relatively new one, but the other three have been upheld as constitutional in our Supreme Court in some pretty famous cases. The cases are called Keegstra, and Zundel was another one, and there's a more recent one called Whatcott. And if your listeners are interested, those cases are all discussed in really straightforward language in our book, Free Speech in Canada.
That's great. I'm looking forward to reading it myself. I did co-author a piece in The Hub recently with your colleague, Joanna Barron, about the Jewish-specific question. We're both Jewish ourselves, and our community has been represented by people lately who have been working in tandem with the Trudeau government in order to censor the internet and to censor anti-Semites. Now, obviously, I hate anti-Semitism and all of that, but I'm not sure the censorship approach is actually working very well. Do you think that the rising tension that we're seeing in cities like Montreal, the rising protests, the political tension, is any of that due to the fact that government is perhaps not handling this well by going to censorship instead of leadership, I guess?
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. I also think that there are much easier laws that police could enforce dealing with protests that block roads and things like that. Your piece in The Hub was excellent. I think you referenced the Zundel case in it, and it sort of shows some of the problem with hate speech laws. Now, Zundel was a notorious Holocaust denier, and his case took place, years ago before the new special prohibitions on Holocaust denial were part of the criminal code. But his case involved a grotesque spectacle of essentially putting the Holocaust on trial, and where you had these alternative history experts called as witnesses, along with, I believe there were Holocaust survivors who were called to testify. And I mean, this is not
Awful.
something that needs to be settled in a court that way. That's really a kind of bizarre use of our judicial system. So, I have my skepticism about creating community-specific hate speech prohibitions. There's a new proposal for one as well to prohibit residential school denialism. And this is a proposal that would ban or criminalize speech that incites hatred against Indigenous people by, I think the proposal has some specifics that include minimizing the harm of residential schools, which is criminalizing a value judgment. It would also criminalize denying that residential schools were a genocide, which, residential schools are not a good part of Canada's history, but I think that it's still quite fraught as to whether or not they constituted a genocide. And I don't think creating a broad criminal sanction around all of these things is going to lead to anything good, and it would actually undermine the stories of living survivors of residential schools, and instead elevate the rhetoric of people who are seeking to minimize that harm, as it did in the Zundel case.
Christine Van Geyn, the co-author of the book with Josh DeHaas of Free Speech in Canada, A Beginner's Guide from Ancient Roots to Modern Controversies. Where can people pick it up?
They can pick it up on Amazon.ca. It's only $10. It's a short book. You can probably get through it in a weekend, and it's perfect for the holidays.
Great. Can't wait. Thank you so much for your time, and congrats again on probably another hit book.
Thank you so much.
Take care. And I know we dealt with some controversial issues there, whether it's related to anti-Semitism or residential school denialism. No one's saying these issues aren't awful and that people who communicate these things aren't awful people and should be shunned or certainly not promoted. It's another level to start locking them up, because then we get into the question of, well, how many people are we going to jail? Is it going to be thousands, tens of thousands? Are we going to build prisons to house all these internet racists? It's a very expensive and, I would argue, unproductive endeavor. It's much, much easier to ignore racists and go on about your day than to indulge them and give them the promotion and the PR that they seek.